Today's scripture reading is from Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. I shall dwell in the house of the Lord my whole life long.
Our gospel reading comes from the gospel according to St. Matthew, the 6th chapter. And whenever you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners, so that they may be seen by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward. But whenever you pray, go into your room and shut the door, and pray to our Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. When you are praying, do not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do, for they think they will be heard because of their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask him. May God add blessings to the reading, the hearing, and the interpreting of God's holy word. Dr. Jordan Granfer is a research neuroscientist down in the Chicago area. And approximately 15, maybe 18 years ago, he had an experience. And for the briefest moment, he could see clear as day his mother, who had died several years earlier. Knowing that there are lots of experiences like that, he began a research process that's been going on for several years now. And being a neuroscientist, he set up his checks and balances, control groups, and all of that you do with science. And eventually, part of his conclusions, or at least where the research has him at this point in time, is that there's a spot in the brain, there's one little section there that seems to be activated in people that have these experiences that are sometimes called mystical, sometimes spiritual, sometimes metaphysical. And based on his research in being a scientist, his temporary conclusion at this state is that there's a chemical reaction in that part of the brain for whatever reason. They haven't really figured out what triggers that. But basically, it's something that just happens in the brain. One of our problems, and all of us have been pretty much raised, whether we pursued a science degree from grade school onward, we have had the idea that science tells us what reality is. And yet we constantly hear of things that don't fit that narrative. If you pick up the Bible, the number of mystical or strange experiences don't fit science. And so what do? Do we throw the Bible out because it's not scientific? Or is there the possibility that reality is more than the physical world in science? Contemporary transpersonal psychologist and philosopher Ken Wilber strongly argues that reality has more than just one realm or one level. And in his book, Eye to Eye, he picks up on part of the writings of St. Bonaventure. Bonaventure was a 13th century Franciscan theologian, philosopher. And Bonaventure proposes that there are really three eyes that we can see with. And each of those eyes deals with a different strata of reality. He refers to an eye of flesh, which is what science is all about. And it's really good at it because it's what sees the material, physical world. But at the same time, Bonaventure goes on to say, there's also this strata that he refers to as the eye of reason. This is a non-material state of reality. This is the realm of philosophy. This is the realm of mathematics. But it's not rooted in a physical, material thing. It works through our mind. And then finally, Bonaventure goes on to say there's an eye of contemplation. And this is what he refers to as the level or the strata of reality in which we deal with spirit. An actual spiritual reality that is reflected in Scripture, not just Christian Scripture. This is the realm when that eye opens briefly for whatever reason, that we have these so-called mystical experiences. And again, it's a realm in which we cannot reduce it down to a physical thing that I can dissect with one of the five senses. One of the challenges that Wilber talks about is he unpacks part of this model of a tri-level reality, is that when we take the truth that comes out of each one of these realms, if we try to apply it to one of the others, it doesn't work well. This is the core to why we have had centuries of conflict between religion and science. Because the scientist wants to reduce everything down to a material and physical level. Spiritual reality is not physical. Now, it might hit you in the gut when you realize what's happening, but it's not something I can take, put on my shelf, or put under a microscope and dissect. The same with philosophy. It's a realm where the mind can put together incredibly complex patterns that help us make sense of the world. But any time that we begin to cross those levels over between each other, they short circuit. It leaves us having to make a choice that gives us a false reality. Part of what we're talking about in this final segment of the Shalom, Salam, Peace series is we're wrapping up with the idea of inner peace. Inner peace, to me, is something that is a result of the eye of contemplation. It's spiritual. Neuroscientists can pick around the brain, they can activate certain sectors, and you might feel peaceful. But it's not the same thing we're talking about here as inner peace. There's an interesting list of symptoms of inner peace that floats around the internet. It has no author, it's anonymous. But a few of the examples that come off of this list: an unmistakable ability to enjoy each moment, a loss of interest in judging people, a loss of interest in judging yourself, a loss of interest in conflict, a loss of the ability to worry. And whoever wrote this leaves a subnote with that, a very serious symptom. Frequent, overwhelming episodes of appreciation, gratitude, a contented feeling of connectedness with others and with nature. There's a number of others that the list includes, but those give you an idea of what inner peace is. If we take it a step further, what is Psalm 23 really about? It's a description of inner peace. Because of my faith in the Lord, I don't have to worry. I'm taken care of. God is with me every day, in every situation. Deep inner peace is a spiritual experience. In one of the numerous things that St. Bonaventure wrote, he makes this comment in one of his writings. Reason can discover some of the moral truths that form the groundwork of the Christian system. But other truths can only be received and apprehended through divine illumination. In other words, if you don't practice some kind of spiritual practice, you will not encounter deep, transforming spiritual experiences. Which leads us to the question, how do I actually try to open this eye of contemplation? How do I open myself to spiritual experience? Part of that is what we hear from Matthew. Let's have the next slide. Matthew talks about prayer. And prayer in almost every tradition, whatever form that prayer may take, is one of the key practices that can open that eye of contemplation. Doesn't necessarily have to be vocal prayer. Matthew almost implies that silent prayer from the heart and the mind is heard by God as readily as anything we speak. Next slide. Group prayer, the time that we share prayer together, whether in community, with family, with friends, or study groups. Here again, the practice ongoing can allow that eye to catch glimpses of experience and insights that we would not find otherwise. Next. Table grace. And yes, the four-legged ones can be included. Mine will definitely climb up and try to clean my plate for me. But table grace, again, it's a simple practice that when we do it day after day after day, allows us to slip into a different space, which again gives us the opportunity to open that eye of contemplation. Next. Reading Scripture, reading the Bible, reading devotional literature, the volumes written by the saints and the great mystics of the church and every tradition are well springs that can help trigger those moments where the eye of contemplation can develop, strengthen, and catch glimpses. Chanting and singing. The modern church does not always have a strong tradition of chanting anymore. But if you look at monastic communities, if you come and check out some of the Taizé services that we will be starting again in May after Easter, chanting again is one of those things on a regular basis that moves us into a different space, a different experience. Here's one we don't associate very readily. Dance and song. Movement. Think of some of the scenes that you see from Jerusalem from time to time with the very traditional Hasidic Jews standing at the wall of the temple. Prayer book, book of Psalms, but they're not just standing there reciting it. They're doing this, they're moving. Movement, even dance. Our Islamic cousins in the Sufi tradition do these incredible whirling circular dances. And it's in those moments where they lose themselves and the eye of contemplation opens. Here again. How often do we find music stirs our emotions, touches us in ways that physical touch cannot do? We're moved. I can remember the first time I heard the Pie Jesu from Andrew Lloyd Webber's Requiem for his father. It is absolutely ethereal. The mind stops, and you're moved into a totally different space. Another one we normally don't think about very often as a spiritual practice. And yet ritual is at the heart of so many religions, so many traditions. This table and the ritual that we share here is another one of the ways that we can be transported into a transcendent moment if we open the heart and open the mind. The results of these kinds of experiences opening to the Spirit, cracking open our mind, our heart to receive God's Spirit. And again, without a regular practice that moves us into those in-between spaces, this is difficult to experience. Excellent. God with us. The words, Emmanuel, that we hear every Advent. In these practices, we deepen and strengthen our connection to the divine, the Imago Dei, the image of God that lives within us. Lamb and wolf. Isaiah tells us that they'll lie down together. When we discover the incredible balance, the radical center that these practices can move us into. If you think of the cover of your bulletin, you have the child, you have the fierce lion, you have the sheep. Again, part of what happens when we take time to do these practices, we don't react and overreact to various situations around us that we encounter. Our life becomes more balanced, more centered. Our perspective shifts from whatever's happening this moment to a wider view and a bigger picture. These practices help us begin to see the way God intended us to see. When we're in balance, it's no longer about just me versus the world. That change in perspective says, I am a key part of the world. And what I do affects the world. And yes, what the world does affects me as well. But the other trick that happens here is that I begin to sense and realize that the world is not just either or. Because all too often, especially with a view that comes rooted in physical reality, it's black or it's white. Yeah, there's some of this weird gray stuff, but I'm going to lean one way or the other in how I choose to interpret this. When we become deeply rooted in inner peace, we begin to realize it's one big coin. You can't separate the two. It's not either or, it's both and. And when we realize that, we begin to lose concern about exclusivity, and it all becomes inclusive. Because I can't split that coin in half. It's both and. Last week, Reverend Yvette mentioned the ragamuffin gospel and how God intends us to be people pointing to God, not pointing to my acts for God. When we become balanced and centered and rest in an inner peace, whether we realize it or not, we are pointing to God. People see it. St. Bonaventure and Ken Wilber both invite us to recognize that there are multiple levels of reality and ways to understand them. Let us open our eye of spirit. Let us change ourselves. Let us engage in a spiritual practice of some sort. And then the possibility of experiencing the transcendent and settling into a deep, deep inner peace is possible. And within that inner peace, it changes our perception. It changes our view of life and the world. That in turn ripples outward from us, encounters the world and changes it. And it creates shalom, salam, and peace. Amen.